Hi everyone, my name is Regina Brown. For this presentation, I looked at gender inequality in the workplace, focusing on pay gaps and the glass ceiling. I reviewed 6 research articles from different fields like business, advertising, psychology, policing, and public administration. Together, they show how barriers show up in different ways but lead to the same result. Women are still underrepresented in higher level positions and leadership roles. Article 1 is about personality traits and whether they help explain gender wage gaps and the glass ceiling. This quantitative study used probability sampling with stratified and cluster sampling, so the author was able to look at patterns across a large group of workers. The researcher wanted to see if differences in traits like agreeableness or risk taking between men and women could explain part of the wage gap and lack of women in top positions. The findings showed that personality traits only explain a small part of the gap, around 7% overall, and about 11 to 12% at higher wage levels. Traits like agreeableness and risk taking played the biggest role. Most of the wage gap stayed unexplained, which suggests that organizational and structural factors are still doing most of the work, with personality playing only a small part. Article 2 looks at the glass ceiling from an emotional point of view. This is a qualitative study that used convenience and snowball sampling. The researchers talked with women about how they experience the glass ceiling and how repeated barriers affect their hope, their motivation, and future career plans. Women in the study described the glass ceiling as discouraging and emotionally draining. Many of them said that running into the same barriers over and over reduced their hope and made advancement feel like it was out of reach, even when they knew they were capable and qualified. Some women responded by lowering their ambitions or pulling back from promotional opportunities, not because they didn't care, but because they were tired of fighting the same battle. Article 3 focuses on women in advertising. This was another qualitative study that used purposive sampling and snowball sampling. The authors wanted to understand how women in advertising experience gender bias, workplace culture, and obstacles to moving up. They found that gender strongly shapes women's experiences in agencies. It influences the jobs women are hired into, the kinds of roles they are steered toward, and their chances for advancement. Women were often passed over for managerial roles while men were favored. The study also pointed out the contrast with femvertising, where companies use ads with empowerment messages but do not always practice equality inside their own organizations. The authors questioned whether the industry will eventually match its public messaging or continue to lag behind social movements for equality. Article 4 moves into clinical psychology, which is actually a female-dominated field. This was a qualitative study that used purposive sampling. The goal was to explore how clinical psychologists experience gender bias, implicit discrimination, and barriers to advancement. Women in the study reported being overlooked for promotion and described assumptions about maternity leave and commitment. They also talked about men being primed for leadership roles. Another important piece was sideways sexism, where some female colleagues criticized or undermined other women who advanced. Overall, leadership was still viewed as masculine, and that mindset created ongoing barriers even in a field where most of the workers are women. Article 5 looks at women patrol officers and asks whether they are truly opting out of promotions. This is a mixed method study that used purposive sampling pulled from a larger mixed methods project along with snowball sampling. The researchers wanted to know if women simply did not want promotions or if the workplace environment was shaping their decisions. They found that most women were interested in moving up. However, many delayed promotion because they wanted more experience or were balancing family responsibilities with difficult shift schedules, or they felt discouraged by how promotional exams were designed. The issue was not a lack of ambition. The real problem was the set of barriers inside the organization that made promoting harder for women. Article 6 shifts to public sector bureaucracies and women in leadership. This was a quantitative study that used cluster sampling to look at how glass ceiling affects women's ability to move into and succeed in leadership roles. The study found that women's underrepresentation in leadership is shaped by three main areas: societal, organizational, and individual factors. On the personal side, lower income and less access to development opportunities held women back. At the organization level, policies that were not gender inclusive and pressure from colleagues also made advancement more difficult. These issues reinforce the glass ceiling and limit women's chances of reaching leadership positions. My main takeaways from this project was honestly, I was surprised by the idea that personality traits might play any role at all in wage gaps, even if it is a small one. I had always assumed that the gap was almost entirely structural, so it made me think more about how individual traits and organizational factors can interact. Second, several of the articles confirmed patterns that I have seen or that I had heard about in real life. Women are often encouraged into support roles, while men are nudged into leadership. When women do move up, they can face more scrutiny than men in similar positions. Third, the idea of sideways sexism really stood out to me. I had not thought much about how women's interactions with each other might also shape advancement, especially when who are promoted are judged more harshly by other women. I was not surprised that women in policing and in public leadership still feel discouraged by workplace culture, but it was discouraging to see how consistent those barriers still are across very different fields. These six studies made me think about how many of these barriers operate quietly. They show up in culture, expectations, assumptions, and even in how much hope people feel about their chances to advance. Thank you. Any questions?